This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM, all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to WRFL Lexington 88.1 FM. This is Eric Weber here with you to play for you another episode of Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is episode number 75 with Monica McCarthy, All Philosophy's a Stage.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Philosophy Bakes Bread, food for thought about life and leadership.
Philosophy Bakes Bread is a production of the Society of Philosophers in America, aka SOPHIA. I'm Dr. Eric Thomas Weber.
And I'm Dr. Anthony Cashio. A famous phrase says, "The philosophy bakes no bread." That is not practical, but we in SOPHIA and on this show aim to correct that misperception.
Philosophy Bakes Bread airs on WRFL Lexington 88.1 FM and is distributed as a podcast next. Listeners can find us online at philosophybakesbread.com, and we hope you'll reach out to us on Twitter at philosophybb, on Facebook at philosophybakesbread, or by email at philosophybakesbread@gmail.com.
Last but not least, don't forget you can leave us a short recorded message with a question or a comment or, even some bountiful praise. We'll always take that we may be able to play on the show. And you can reach us at 859-257-1849. That's 859-257-1849. So today we're very excited to be talking with Monica McCarthy. Hi, Monica.
Hey. Hi, thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to call this episode All Philosophy's a Stage. Monica is a thespian, a playwright, the founder of the Cheshire Parlor, which we'll have to ask her about, and the creator and host of the Happier Hour podcast. You're quite creative and entrepreneurial person, it seems, Monica. That seems like a fair assessment.
Do what I can.
That's right. So Monica has acted in television programs, film, and advertisements, including an appearance on the show 6 Feet Under, I understand, for example.
God. Yeah,
which is an amazing show. Yeah. Well, very impressive. We connected with Monica, especially in relation to her work on the Happier Hour podcast, which her website describes as, quote, equal parts philosophy and self-help with a dash of humor thrown in for taste.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, we love food metaphors here on Philosophy Bakes Bread. And, we have a friend in common. We had Dr. Skye Cleary on our show in episode 60 titled Existentialism and Romantic Love, the title of her book. And she's been on your show too, right, Monica?
Yes, absolutely. She's one of my close friends here in New York City.
Well, she's fantastic, and so we're very glad to connect with you as well.
This is going to be fun. You provide the food, I provide the drinks.
Oh, I like that.
Hopefully there'll be some humor.
We've actually talked about doing liquid bread episodes, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Just give me a call.
All right. I like where this is going. Well, all right. So today's episode is going to highlight the connection and your experience between theater and performance with philosophy. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right. Which is nowhere more clearly seen together than in your podcast. But before all that, Monica, in each episode, we want to make sure that our listeners know something about our guest, about you. So philosophy isn't about what a book says or what some theory proposes, though it is also about that. But philosophers are people, and people live through philosophical challenges. And so we want our listeners to really connect with who we're talking to. So we call our first segment Know Thyself.
Know Thyself.
And we want to know whether you know yourself. We're going to get a little test. So maybe you could tell us about yourself, about your background, about how your background shaped who you are, maybe how you came interested in philosophy and theater and sort of how you see it all come together. So who is Monica McCarthy?
Well, it's so funny because you mentioned this as a test, and I'm like, man, I'm going to fail this test so hard because it's a process. And I know that, I listened to your show. I really enjoy it. And a lot of the guests have described it as it's either separate chapters or stages or what in their life, depends where they're at. And it's perfect that we are talking about sort of the metaphor, it's actually from Shakespeare's As You Like It, of all the world being a stage and each act of man being 7 ages. So I'm not sure which age I'm in right now, but but it's a wild ride. So I guess what I would say kind of encapsulates the theme of my life as a play thus far would be my mom tells the story that when I was younger, she would call me Emma from Jane Austen's novel, Emma, because of this line where she's speaking with Harriet or Emma's speaking with Harriet, and Emma says, she's talking about this other character, Mrs. Elton, and she's like, there's only one thing to do with a person as impossible as she is. And, Harriet's like, what? And Emma's like, I must throw a party for her. Otherwise, everyone will feel at once how much I dislike her. And,
that's pretty good.
I know that's not necessarily painting me in the positive. Like, there's good that can go for good and bad. And that actually would go, Mom. That was actually pretty accurate description of how I just approach things. Of if there's the theme is there's something I want, I'm not naturally good at it. I don't know how to get it, but I'm going to figure out how to do it. If there's somebody that doesn't like me, okay, we're going to be best friends. That's just what's going to happen. So yeah, and that started really young because I grew up in Southern California and I'm an only child and both my parents worked full time. So I developed quite a vivid imagination. And I also spent a lot of time in the YMCA after school and in summer camps. And I was super, super shy though, apparently. This is really hard for me to believe now. But somebody suggested they put me in acting class to help get me out of my shell. And they did. And I'm sure they've regretted that decision ever since.
Seems to have worked.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah. And so that really led to musical theater summer camps. Then I got there, man, everyone can sing and dance and I couldn't, so then I was like, okay, I'm going to learn how to do this, and that really led to, that was my passion. That was really what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And, did all the things of the high school musicals and went to theater at Pepperdine University because of scholarship. And I majored in theater there. But while I was there, two very interesting things happened. One, I took a program called the Great Books Colloquium, which is essentially, some schools have it, some don't. So some people are familiar, but it's essentially like a 2-year program in philosophy. And that my high school boyfriend that I followed to college, who broke up with me, thought, yeah, I know, but I forgive him because he's
his loss, right?
That's what I'm going to tell myself. But he did introduce me. The point being, he did introduce me. He would really like, he was a year ahead of me. And he was like, you would really like this program. And so, he was good for something. And so, and then also I said that was the first time that I really traveled outside of the country and studied abroad. And so I mentioned those two things because those became also very important things in my life. And I still have on my bookshelf, actually, like my very tattered and loved copies of Introduction to Aristotle and Plato's The Republic. And these were discussion-based classes, very small, 8 to 12 people. And we weren't really writing papers. And so there was a rule that you couldn't speak it was on your honor system. You weren't allowed to join the conversation if you hadn't done the reading. And, it seems very obvious, but now as an adult, man, if we could apply that to so many things in life.
Right.
There wouldn't be a lot of people speaking, Monica. That's the problem.
I do it in my class. I don't know if any of my students would ever speak.
But this just active participation, again, was something that I found very interesting. And then I ended up moving to New York City and hit the pavement. And long story short, was very fortunate and did end up getting to do some things, make a living off of it and get to Broadway. But then I hit sort of another interesting age in my life, literally, I guess, 30. And it all kind of went to crap. And it was funny because
what's the it in that sentence?
Life.
Okay. Yeah, life all went to crap.
It does. Well, it does around the age of 30.
All of my ideas went to crap. So I distinctly remember I was understudying two celebrity actresses on Broadway, and I remember sitting below the stage, and I was looking at all of the New York Times at what other plays were happening, because your job will end when the show ends, and I realized all the roles that I would be right for were all played by celebrities, and this feels sort of hopeless. And long story short, I was engaged, called that off, quit acting, and I want to travel. That'll solve all my problems. I'll eat, pray, live my life. And then you find out that doesn't work either. You have to actually, wherever you go, there you are. So yeah. And so then when I came back, wow, I sound like a Debbie Downer. But when I came back, I was like, okay, clean slate. What do I want to do? I miss those conversations from college where we talk. Yeah. Because at that point, I skipped ahead of a lot of things, but I had a few different careers and that and blah, blah, blah. And it's interesting when actors get together in a room full of other actors, it just turns to complaining. And you know what? It's the same thing when writers get in a room with other writers and entrepreneurs get in a room with other entrepreneurs, and even travel writers get in a room with other travel writers. And so there needs to be diversity at the table in order to actually have conversations about things involving like the meaning of life. So that's when I started the Cheshire Parlor, which I named. Yes, we're getting, see, it all comes full circle.
It's like you planned this.
No, actually, and as I'm speaking, I'm like, all he did was ask me, who am I?
Yeah, keep going. We love it.
Okay, great. So the Cheshire Parlor is because I was a huge Alice in Wonderland fan, and the Cheshire Cat, obviously representing like curiosity, and also sort of an homage to the Chat Noir in Paris, where I was very envious of like the Gertrude Stein sort of salons where philosophers and artists writers would come together to talk about life and then improve their own work. And then the parlor being because the salon really was more actually formal space. Parlors were where the real conversation happened. And so I invited people, most people that I didn't know that I'd wanted to meet that had really interesting ideas. I would curate, each dinner had a different topic. So like freedom or truth or time, and I would curate a manifesto on that idea, like literally like write down what I was hearing people saying and then create a poster of that. And then that ended up leading to this really weird career as like a philosophical impresario and working with organizations to help them either write their own manifesto or they would hire me to actually like produce and host events.
Wait. So you get hired to host an event and then you just listen to the conversation and then afterwards you take basically what you heard in the conversation and turn it into a manifesto?
Well, the truth is I'm actually facilitating the conversation.
Facilitating, okay.
Yeah. So for these dinners, it's going to be hard. If I'm like, hey, what do you feel about truth? You're going to be like, I like it. I mean, as a philosopher, you might have more of an answer, but like, yeah, like that's really hard.
Sometimes truth isn't truth though, so we have to be careful.
Oh God, don't even get me started.
Oh Lord. So,
but the thing is like, this is why most people don't really go into these conversations because they're not easy, and it's like, where am I going to start from? And so what I did was I curated quotes based on famous thinkers that had different takes on the topic, and then I'd write them on note cards and let each person pull one, and then would do like Socratic dialogue, like, do you agree? Do you disagree? Why not? Do you have an example of your life? And so it could just start from there. And so it was a really nice. So then what was fun was by the end when you saw the manifestos, you saw the kernel of the initial thought that had been in there from the previous thinker of your, but then you saw how it was transformed or added to by, somebody at the table.
That is a super cool project.
Thanks.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
thank you.
I really like that idea.
Thanks. TM. What is that? The trademark. And so, yeah. And that, I mean, really then for several years, and it led to doing that and then hosting workshops, and then I was really interested in kind of hosting this sort of fireside chat model. So there's Inside the Actor's Studio with James Lipton, which, very, very famous. And I'd watched all of those. But a lot of times, again, I live in New York City. There's tons of events. There's tons of conferences. There's tons of facilitated conversations. And oftentimes they just kind of suck. They're for whatever reason. We don't even need to go down the road. But so now I am able to do both things, and I'm back to acting. I started studying with this great method acting teacher in New York City named Tony Greco, and that's really changed my life. And then I host the Happier Hour, which is now like my own program, and I do that at a space called Caveats, where I started in the very end of 2017. And it's a live event where I interview one academic philosopher, two philosophic-ish experts, and then I record those and add commentary. And I just launched on August 2nd the Happier Hour podcast.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're going to have a chance to ask you all about, the Happier Hour podcast and the show and how you think about philosophy and theater and how that's all come together in just a second. But before we go on, we'd like to sort of end this first segment by asking, an important question, real hard question, I think, but, right? Well, you do all this stuff with philosophy. What is it? What is philosophy? What do you think philosophy is? How would you try to define or describe it to someone who doesn't know what philosophy is?
Great question, of course. I personally like to think of philosophy as critical thinking fueled by curiosity.
I like it.
And I like the way that I say it is like philosophy tests what we think we know. It's not a test of what we know. And I think that people are often very intimidated, and they don't like to think of themselves as philosophers because it seems like this big test. Do you know who said this and who said what? And instead of really thinking of philosophy as something that's very expansive, actually.
Awesome. Well, this has been a really fun first segment of Philosophy Bakes Bread. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We've been talking with Monica McCarthy. This is Eric Weber. My co-host is Anthony Cashio, and we'll come back after a short break.
Welcome back, everyone, to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber, and we're here talking today, having a really wonderful conversation with Monica McCarthy in an episode we've titled All Philosophy's a Stage. In this segment, we'll ask Monica about theater, storytelling, and acting, and how these things connect with her interest in philosophy. And in the next segment, we'll ask her to tell us about the Happier Hour podcast and how her combined interests came to inspire and shape the show that she's created, which sounds like a super amazing show. I want to get up to New York and see it, actually. So, yeah, Monica, I was chomping at the bit last segment. I really want to talk about this more. You've kind of proposed this connection between theater and philosophy, and you sort of woven it into your life and your career, and I think that's fantastic. So maybe just a really simple question: what do you see as the relationship between theater, or maybe acting, and philosophy, or?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So many things. David Mamet, who is a playwright and a director, he has this quote that really struck me that he said, "We go to the theater to find out what the hell is going on in this world."
I love it.
And it strikes me that philosophy is trying to do something similar. And so to me, when you look at the great playwrights, they are philosophers. And there's so many parallels. I mean, could go on, like Nietzsche and Macbeth. You know, I mean, Macbeth was obviously the character of Shakespeare's playwright, but like they're both trying to understand for themselves what ambition does and power, and they could go on. And so first of all, there's the actual the themes of the play and the questions the playwright asks throughout the play and the problem they're trying to solve. So every good play and every good story of that ilk is really trying to solve a problem. And then there's also what you actually go through as an actor is very philosophical in a lot of ways, because again, maybe it depends on how you study it, but it's about asking questions. You know, what does my character want? What are the obstacles in my way? How am I going to get it? But then it has to go even more personal. There's that saying, it's like the more personal you get, the more universal you get. And so it's looking at these characters in a way that's very personal, but that will reveal something very universal. So that's why when you go to, and then for the audience, it's very cathartic because you're going and you're seeing these questions that you have about your own life lived out on stage. And if it's, again, a really great play, you end up going home with even more questions and then starting a dialogue and blah, blah, blah. So all of that, I know that's a little bit of an obtuse answer, but there's so much. Like, philosophy really is the study of learning the why, but theater in a lot of ways lets us see the how.
Oh, I like that. That's good.
Interesting. So here's a hypothesis maybe. Could acting be like philosophy insofar as you have to understand where someone's coming from to appreciate their ideas maybe? Or, do you have to understand a person or a character in order to act like him or her?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say that word understand, because we don't really know, right? The playwright's given you a set of fixed givens based on, even the dialogue itself is a given. And then it's like being a detective in a way, of trying to uncover what is trying to be revealed and then adding yourself to it. But yes, it can't just be what is amazing about it is you can't just enter into a character in your own rhythm. That's sort of a language that we use in acting talk, but you have to, to start with, it's not going to be your own rhythm. I've got to give credit to Tony Greco for a lot of what I'm about to say about acting, my teacher. So you start with, okay, I don't know what this character's rhythm is or what this character's needs are or whatever it is, but I know it's not mine. So I'm going to start with that. Mm-hmm. Versus a lot of actors get into acting because they want to, have this cathartic experience. And so they really start with themselves, which I don't actually believe is the right way. But this idea of pursuing acting or trying to start with understanding a character by expanding your own perspective is very philosophical. Because in order to really commit to playing a character, you have to first, know something about yourself, so that you can then do something about it, right, and then fully commit to it. So, yeah.
Interesting.
Very, very philosophical. And Lee Strasberg, who was one of the founders of the method, he has this great quote: "Our work begins when others say that's enough." Because if you have to play Blanche Dubois in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, you have to play, Stanley Kowalski. Like Stanley Kowalski, the actor playing that has to find out, how is this character going to rape his sister-in-law? How is Othello going to put a pillow over Desdemona's face in any way that the audience can feel is real? Like, we have to understand that arc, that journey that gets that character, the pathology of the character that gets them to that place. And again, it just saying that just brought to mind like Hannah Arendt and talking about the banality of evil and what she is trying to do to understand how people can do what they do. And not just from a psychological perspective, but really like what is fundamental to humanity.
So you've anticipated one of our questions. Actually, I want to jump in on this because this is one of the challenges. Like I can't imagine how someone could commit certain kinds of murders, or if you think about like the most grotesque examples, like this guy named Castro in Cleveland who had women locked in his house. I mean, I'm not saying there's a movie or play about that, but there could be. How does one look for the universal in the particular, or whatever, as you said, put it? I think I can't imagine how someone could ever do anything like that. How can anyone be an actor to represent such a character? You know what I mean? Like, it seems like you need some amount of understanding or knowledge about that, but yet it seems so foreign.
It has to do with judgment as well. And I'm not saying like in the real world, judgment actually is important. We're judging people all the time, and even though it's on trend right now to be like, don't judge me, like we do judge people, and we need to judge so that we know not to like run in front of that bus. In order to play quote unquote bad guys, you have to start from the perspective of no one does things for an intention of a negative outcome. Everyone does things, even if it's something that actually ends up causing ourselves harm, for what we think of as going to be a positive outcome.
Right.
And so there's needs, whatever reason or whatever ends up happening, there are needs that character has that they are taking actions to fulfill those needs. And then it's your job as the actor to try to reveal first for yourself and then hopefully to the audience why that character is doing what they're doing. And that's not at all, I don't want that to be misunderstood as just like justifying it as approving it. It's not that. But if we don't, and this is something that's been happening since, you look at the ancient Greeks and you look at the tragedies. I mean, if you look at the one where the guy like gouges his eyes out, why can't I think of it?
Oedipus.
Thank you, Oedipus. I literally talked about that in a podcast. Or, Medea or whatever. The ancient Greeks understood that it's human nature to need to understand how dark we can go so that we don't do it ourselves, hopefully. So
we don't have to sympathize with the bad person, but we have to try and understand.
Yeah, because if look, the most dangerous thing that we could say about, maybe a certain president or something is saying like, oh, well, they're just crazy. And if you say that, then they can do whatever they want because there's no... It's like, okay, here's another example. Actors love, and people, we love to talk about our feelings, right? Like, why I feel this. And the reason why we like that is because you can't argue with me about that. Like, I could tell you, like, hey, right now I am ecstatic. And you couldn't tell me, no, you're not, because you don't know how I feel.
Right, exactly.
But if I was, right now, I'm skydiving, you could be pretty sure I'm not skydiving right now. So our actions are what actually reveal who we are, not our feelings.
I like that. Our actions reveal who we are. And so, I was thinking about what you were saying earlier as well, right? How sort of the more personal you get, the more sort of universal it is for the actor and for the audience as well, right? And so you have these characters that you get worried about, right? So Macbeth's ambition.
Exactly. Like the more, it's funny, actually, I did a program with Shakespeare & Company, and they do like non-traditional casting for stuff. And I got to play Macbeth in this intensive, and never a character I ever thought I would be playing for sure. And I was so fascinated by the journey. Like he's not Richard III. His motivations are very different.
Right.
And so they're not, again, not all bad guys are the same. They're not all in the corner, twisting their mustache, So it actually becomes very tragic, because who amongst us doesn't understand what it's like to feel wronged and cheated, and then to have other people like whisper in our ear, like, hey, you could do this, you can do this, you can do this. And so Macbeth could really be any of us. And Shakespeare, part of the reason why he's so genius is he understands that.
Nice.
Very good. There's always been this sort of like this long history of sort of being suspicious of the theater, almost being dangerously philosophical in this way. So, for instance, in Plato's Republic, Plato just suggests kicking out all the poets and playwrights. Just kick them all out if you want a good society, because they're corrupting people, right? They manipulate us with falsehoods. They're lying. That the people need to look to the philosophers for the truth in some other different kind of way. I'm not quite sure Plato's right about it, but it's sort of an interesting challenge. If Plato were here now, what would you say to him? Right? He says, "I'm going to so just kick them all out." Right? They're lying to you. They're tricking you. Right? They're manipulating you in these.
Who am I to knock on Plato? Because obviously, he brought us a lot. But what I would say to Plato is look throughout history at when governments have repressed theater and expression, and see how well that went. Because whenever that has happened, even during the Holocaust, even during horrible times, people found a way to create, it doesn't look like theater, like you're going to a Broadway show, but they were still doing theater. Like they were still reading poetry. They were still creating art, however and wherever they can. And that is also part of human nature. And I understand the fear about theater. Like I understand, look, you've got Hamilton. A lot of people, when Hamilton first came out, before it got the stamp of approval of popularity, were like, this is ruining musical theater. I just want Oscars and Hammerstein. And it's actually, you're comparing apples and oranges. It's brilliant in its own right for what it is. And the amazing thing is it just brought a whole generation of people to the theater that were never coming before. So theater and philosophy to me is very much the same way. To me, philosophers are actually rebels. We don't think of it that way because of but especially, the philosophers of yore, the philosophers that we study, most of them were not philosophy professors. Their lives, a lot of them were actually kind of intense and crazy in and of themselves. And that's partly how they were able to come up with some of the ideas that they did.
Right on. Well, so we've got only a little bit of time left. Who are your favorite philosophical playwrights, Monica?
Great question. It has to be Shakespeare, obviously has to be on there. Chekhov for sure. Mm-hmm. There's a character in the Cherry Orchard that says, does it matter what we do? We all die in the end. That doesn't get more philosophical than that. I really also like Beth Henley. She's a more contemporary playwright, and the way that she's able to pose these sort of philosophical questions in a very both comedic and dramatic and a little bit larger than life, but still somehow so true sense. And Donald Margulies, I got to give him props since that was the Broadway play that I did one of his plays. And I do think that he, again, a contemporary playwright who is very, you can see in his writing that he is very truly invested in trying to understand and not trying to preach.
Nice. Well, excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for listening to this segment of Philosophy Bakes Bread. We're going to come back with 2 more after a short break. You've been listening to Monica McCarthy, Eric Weber, and my co-host Anthony Cashio. Thanks for listening, and we'll be right back.
If you're hearing this, that means podcast advertising works. WRFL is now accepting new applications for advertising in a selection of our original podcast series. If you or someone you know owns a business in Central Kentucky and would be interested in advertising on WRFL's original podcasts, please email development@wrfl.fm.
Welcome back, everyone, to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber talking today with Monica McCarthy in an episode, All Philosophy's a Stage. In the last segment, we had a really awesome conversation with Monica about her interest in theater and acting and how it relates to philosophy. And I I thought it was fantastic. Finding the universal and the personal, that made my day. It really did. I like that. And the segment will be asking Monica about the Happier Hour podcast that she has created and launched in August.
Yeah, so Monica, let's start with the big picture. Our listeners are interested in philosophy, and you've launched a philosophical podcast. Tell us about it and what prompted you to launch the podcast. What's it all about?
Sure. Well, I had just kind of had this idea in the back of my mind for a while about, it would be really fun to have an event that is somehow focused on philosophy, but that isn't a traditional, it's not, an author's reading of their work, and it's not an academic conference setting. And so I had this idea spinning my mind. And actually, Skye Cleary, who you mentioned at the top of the show, who's a friend of mine and who we both had on our shows, she said, there's this new space in New York City, and I know they want to do things about like intelligent nightlife. Like, we should go check it out. So we went and saw a show there. Yeah, this is the spot that I want to at least start with. And I pitched the idea to them, and they were like, yep, great, let's do it. And then they're like, okay, so how's 2 weeks from now? And it would have been December 29th. In between Christmas and New Year's, which is dead zone in New York City. And I was like, okay, great, we'll do it. This sort of ties back to my personality, like I said in the beginning. Okay, great, worst time slot ever, let's do it. And
I'm going to make this happen.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and again, to tie in actually a philosophical idea and an acting idea. In acting, they always talk about you've got to make a strong choice, because otherwise you're just sort of reading the lines. And if you're going to make a strong choice, that involves a risk. So, okay, we're going to do this. And because I had hosted very similar style events of 3 guests, I understood how the flow is going to go. I understood the kinds of questions, the feel, the vibe. And then just instinctually, because so then actually what I thought about was, well, what do I really want to accomplish with this show? And that was where I realized, okay, I want to help be a bridge, just like you guys are trying to do as well, like be a bridge between academic philosophy and everyone else. And I wanted to show that philosophy can actually be helpful and useful in our everyday lives. And I wanted to show that it could be fun. And I also felt very committed to having a diverse set of voices in the room. So that helped me set parameters. So I decided, okay, I'm going to have 3 guests. 1 always has to be an academic philosopher, and 2 are what I'm going to call philosophic-ish people. So we've had an expert in Bitcoin, we've had a futurist, we've had a rapper, we've had best-selling author, we've had, so many different kinds of people, but people that have a clear philosophy to their work, and that it was related to. So the topic of the night was also, it wasn't going to be like, okay, we're going to talk about Plato's Republic. It was, we're going to talk about love, or we're going to talk about the very first one, since it was right before New Year's, it was resolutions. And I said, okay, well, I'll tie in each person to a philosopher as well. So that way we could cover like sort of 3 philosophers of philosophical ideas. So it's 3 different perspectives on that one topic. And then I realized when I was starting to write down names of people, I really was coming up with a lot of white males, which is a problem in like conferences and things like that. We all know not white males aren't the problem, but having only white males up there. And so because if we're saying, hey, one of the goals of philosophy is to challenge our own perspectives. Okay, well then let's actively seek out people who might have a different perspective. So then I was like, okay, for myself, one of the rules is I can't have more than 1 white male up there. That's it. Everything else we're good. So, and that's a little controversial. Some people might not agree with it, but I stand by it. And it's my show. So,
it's your show.
Yeah, and it's for a good reason. It's again, I think this is where philosophy helps. So like when you're clear on your values and you understand your why, okay, whatever, you don't like it, okay, someone else. So, but it actually ended up working out great. And the New York Times actually wrote it up in as a thing to come do and see. And so we like filled the house. Yeah. And I picked 3 people that I knew because, this was all new. So I had Professor Massimo Pigliucci to talk about Stoicism. And I had Rita King, who is a futurist. And I had Dory Clark, who is an author and entrepreneur. And and it was really fun. And so I had an inkling. People had asked me with some of the other events, do you record these? Do you have a podcast? No, not really. No. And then I thought, okay, they have the capabilities at this space. Like I could pay them to record the audio. So I was like, I'm going to do it just in case. And then once I started announcing shows, people were asking, and I realized, okay, if I'm saying I want philosophy to be accessible for more people, that has to mean outside of New York City. So that's when I decided, okay, this is going to be a podcast, but it's just a lot of work to do the events and figure out the podcast at the same time. So I put the events on hold for the summer and launched the podcast on August 2nd, 2018. And we'll start up the events again this September.
Awesome. Well, for what it's worth, I loved the episode that was talking about resolutions and stoicism. I thought that was really cool. In short, it was this idea that New Year's resolutions are these things that we tend to break, and then we just decide we're going to wait a whole year before we try again. But that's not the way to think about these things. You can always start again today, kind of thing. I love that insight. I was listening to that episode, I think yesterday, and really enjoyed it. It was you have a very interesting mix in what you do between kind of some sort of let's say studio recording moments, as well as mixing in sessions at the performance, right? Or at the event where you have it. So tell us about how you came to develop your format, where you have live audience conversations, and then you also have these moments of the narrator, right? Tell us about your format and what you're thinking about that.
Sure. Yeah. So when I was doing the live show, as I mentioned, I had 3 guests on each time, and a live format is just going to be different than doing on air, as you know. So one of the main differences was in order, to sort of keep the audience's attention and just the amount of time that we had for the live show, I wasn't able to go as in depth per se on particularly like the history of the philosopher or the philosophy or something that we were discussing. And so I knew when it came time to do it as a podcast, especially when I went back and listened to the recordings, I realized, okay, so now I've got an opportunity to add in some commentary so that it isn't just, plopping in the live event feed into this format. And so I kind of created this formula that every time I was going to do a new intro story, a conclusion, and then 1 or 2 commentaries that go more in depth on each topic. And then I added the bonus episodes every Sunday. So that's all completely new material that is really just more anecdotal of me sharing a story about philosophy in my own life or in culture.
Awesome. That sounds really fantastic.
Very cool. Yeah, and it is.
Thanks.
So I was looking at, you have an awesome webpage, by the way, for the happier hour.
Oh, that means a lot because that's just me and Squarespace.
Squarespace are killing it. I was looking at your tagline. It says, it's like the self-help section, only way funnier, smarter, and with booze. I approve of all of that. But, I was thinking about a philosophy as self-help. How do you see that? And then I might ask you about the booze after that.
How do I see philosophy itself?
As self-help. You said so.
Got it.
It's like the self-help section. How do you see philosophy sort of helping, I guess, people?
Yeah, well, I mean, the philosophy, or at least Western philosophy, when we look back at the ancient Greeks, as you know, it really was initially sort of a form of self-help in the sense that it was meant to actually be helpful. So most of the citizens, took part in some sort of, philosophy-based study or discussion. And so the idea that it is something that is actually something that we can apply to our lives, and it's not just theoretical, particularly when it comes to ethical philosophy, is something that I think maybe we've forgotten a bit. And it, self-help has such a negative connotation, and in many ways it deserves that. So I feel like, if we can,
when it's crappy, right?
Right. So in the sense of, self-help in and of itself, like that term isn't bad. Like there's nothing wrong with wanting to, help oneself.
Helping yourself is good.
Exactly. And, of course, the problem, as we know, is it's just sort of become a lot of banal platitudes, or people, the self-help section is a huge industry, and particularly being a woman. So I have this expression with some of my female friends of, I feel like things are either sold in the self-help department to women who what I call are like the stilettos group or the stones and feathers group. So meaning, it's all about, productivity hacking and having it all. And, or it's about, your mantras and not that mantras are bad, but about like, adult coloring books and not those are bad.
It's like lean in or, what color is your chocolate?
Yeah. What's your aura? What's your chakra?
Right?
Yeah. And, I can be like hippy dippy with stuff. I know my horoscope. I know my Enneagram. I'm a Pisces with an Aquarius rising and a Scorpio moon. Like I know this, but I do feel like, when it comes to giving advice, we have to be very, very, very careful. And, anyone can become a coach today. Anyone can have a platform today. And so there is beauty in having fewer gatekeepers in many ways, but there's also the danger of then who gets to decide what's valuable and what's not. And that's where, again, I think philosophy is actually very helpful because it's asking us to think critically. Like I said in the beginning, my definition of thinking critically, but fueled by curiosity.
Nice. I want to hear Anthony's question about booze.
Well, it's not so much about booze as it about this. You were talking about kind of how philosophy is perceived in the culture. And one way it's perceived as sort of, the armchair philosopher, someone just sitting down. I always imagine someone with an ascot and a pipe. I don't know why, thinking to themselves some great thoughts. But there is a really important social aspect to, I guess, any happy hour. A happy hour is sort of a social event. It is around alcohol. But do you see something very important about the sociality of the happy hour when you do it, like especially as a live show? Is there something interesting philosophically happening when everyone kind of gets together, has a drink, relaxes a little bit, and
absolutely. It's funny because we've talked about Skye Cleary on the show, who's a good friend, and she and I had put together this whole book proposal that I won't give away the name or anything, but it was about like philosophy and cocktails, and each chapter is like a different pun of a philosopher and their work, and it was really funny. And we have a book agent and all that stuff. And when we pitched it, we got some feedback from some people that were like, "I just don't understand the correlation between philosophy and drinking." And I was like, do you know people? Do you know
have you met any philosophers?
Exactly. And and beyond that, because it really doesn't, who cares if you're drinking or not drinking? It really is about, like you said, the social component. And I liked the idea of taking what sort of this traditional view of a happy hour, everybody's going after work to their local watering hole. And like I said in the beginning about why I created Cheshire Parlor, it's usually complaining or gossiping at that point. But it is really important for people to have a place and a time to convene and sort of let off steam. And so the idea that we could kind of maybe recreate that, reinvent it, and just be more intentional about it so that it's still social, it's still being able to like have a drink and unwind if you want, but also doing something that's actually contributing to your well-being by having conversations that matter and actually help you get to know other people better. So yeah, awesome. I mean, that's definitely intentional in there. And that's why I do love that it is both, I love having the podcast format. It still feels very new to me, but in-person events and salons and conversations will probably always have my heart.
Awesome. Well, there's actually one of our past guests who proposed a drinking game on the basis of our show, given how many times I say the word indeed. or how many times Anthony says, I like that.
Well, I say awesome. I say awesome a lot. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm from Southern California, so, it's kind of excusable.
Little valley girl.
I want to push the booze question. Is alcohol an important element of happiness?
I mean, I think so. No, look, it's a social lubricant. What it can, it's not so much is alcohol good or bad. It's like, what is the effect that it's having? And I think that, it's like anything else, of course, in moderation. And I also know
responsibly, folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people right now, it's really about, can you let your guard down just more than you normally do in order to connect with somebody else? And if that's going to be with a great glass of, I don't know why I was thinking Chardonnay. Who drinks Chardonnay? Of Sauvignon Blanc, then great.
Well, I think there's an expression that Ben Franklin said something like, beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy.
Well, funny enough, I actually do host, there's something called Ben Franklin Circles. It's an initiative started by the 92nd Street Y. And it's long story short, it's about like you get together and you talk about one of his 13 virtues every time that you meet. And we usually have wine in the group that I'm in. So
fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we have to take a short break. Thank you, everybody, for listening to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Eric Weber. My co-host is Anthony Cashio, and we've been having a terrific time talking with Monica McCarthy of the Happier Hour podcast. We'll be right back. Hey, everybody, this is Eric Weber here with Philosophy Bakes Bread and WRFL. I have one little announcement I want to make before we start up segment 4, which is that there are 2 terms that we hear in this 4th segment that are important to perhaps have heard before, at least briefly. And one of them is Eudaimonia, and the other one is acedia. Eudaimonia is often translated as happiness, but in a sense it more fully refers to flourishing, according to ancient Greek philosophy. It's kind of basically the way in which you feel and live when you kind of exhibit the virtues that are central to your nature. So when you're really thriving and you're doing your best and engaging in virtuous activity, and often that means with pleasure in the moment or on reflection. Sometimes virtuous activity takes hard work and can be painful and so forth. But in the big picture, you love what you're doing and you get lost in it. That's sort of elements of a flourishing life, which is kind of more than just sort of feeling, oh, I feel happy today. It's not that kind of sense that's so short-lived or oversimplified maybe. Anyway, eudaimonia is translated as happiness, but again refers to more like flourishing in that bigger sense. And then in contrast, acedia refers to a spiritual or mental kind of apathy or sloth or a kind of an emptiness. Acedia is another word that comes up in this fourth segment. Thanks for listening to Philosophy Bakes Bread. Without further ado, here is segment 4 of today's episode, number 75, All Philosophy's a Stage.
Welcome back, everyone, to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber, and today we've been having a really just wonderful conversation with Monica McCarthy. All Philosophy's a Stage. We've been talking about the relationship between theater and philosophy and about Monica's show and podcast that she does called The Happier Hour. In this final segment, we'll ask Monica a few big picture questions. We'll ask her about whether or not philosophy bakes bread and maybe even tell a joke or two. Can't promise they'll be funny, but we'll try. And I'll end with a big picture question for our listeners.
Yep.
Sound good? Yeah. I really like the idea of the happier hour, right? Not that you're not the happiest hour or a happy hour, but happier hour, right? You're already happy. Why don't we just be happier? What insights that you've covered so far in maybe the podcast or on your show have you found to be the most sort of profound in helping yourself and others to be happy? Is there something that you've really just hit home for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so interesting because when we did the live events, that was December 29th through May. And so then I have had this break. So a lot of these were the initial recording was actually, the beginning of the year. So just even seeing kind of what I was talking about then and what's changed since then has been really eye-opening. But I would say, one of the biggest things that seems to be consistent, like it doesn't matter the topic, is really about, I'm trying to think of how to word it exactly, but, and it's going to sound cliche, but it's cliche for a reason, is really the idea of knowing thyself. And that the more that we can attempt to know ourselves, the better that we can be in relationships, the better that, the more efficient we'll be at trying to achieve our goals or achieving the right goals. So it's just been really fascinating that every time it comes down to that, like no matter what. And, we've talked about Stoics, we've talked about existentialists, we've talked about, I think we've had Montaigne in there. We've had, just such a variety, and it doesn't matter the topic or the philosopher. It tends to come down to that. I would also say, let me think. It really is fascinating how they're also really, there aren't really new ideas. It's just it's just how we deal with things now. Like, for example, again, with dating, like now there's the app. But like the anxiety of dating has been around for a while, or, how to express ourselves. Like, well, now we have creative outlets, but the desire to express ourselves, because creativity was one of the topics, has always been there. And so this sort of angst that we have, that we attribute as modern day, isn't just modern. And so therefore the ideas that have existed before are still valid and useful and helpful.
Uh-huh. Right on. So
I like it.
Everybody take a responsible sip.
I know. I'm like trying to think back because, again, like I said, it's been a little while, but even that has been, like I said, that's been really, really cool. Like at the beginning, that the very first episode was about resolutions, and at the time, one of the questions I asked, it was inspired by one of the speakers, was like, do you have a word for the year? And I didn't have one at the time. And so then after the show, I decided, okay, mine was going to be prioritize. And I actually like wrote it on bold letters. It's above my bulletin board right now. And seeing how that's taken shape over the course of, of the year thus far, and seeing that, it's still applicable. I don't know.
Do you find that to be effective? Cool. Just to put a word up? And
I did, because it's not just a word. It's that I had to look at what are my values. I had to go through sort of a philosophical process with myself. Like, what are my values? What are my goals? Or almost like an actor. Okay, what are my objectives? So what are my needs? How am I going to get them? What's standing in my way? And really hone down, because most of us will be like, I'm going to learn a new language, and I'm going to learn to play the guitar, and I'm going to run a marathon, and I'm going to, all of these things. And it becomes a big to-do list of aspirational goals. But if there's not really a real value behind those, I mean, it's no wonder, most of us don't stick with those resolutions. Right. But I don't even mean like grand resolutions, at the beginning of every year. I think this is like a daily practice and a daily habit. And this is, again, why philosophy is so important, because, there's the phrase, if everything's important, nothing's important.
Yeah.
And we use that in acting a lot. So if you go and you see particularly Shakespeare or something, and every syllable is emphasized, and oh my gosh, it's like so dramatic, then we don't take it in. We can't hear it.
Right.
So really knowing when to kind of put your foot on the gas and when to take it off. Wow, I'm throwing in a lot of metaphors.
I love it. I love it. I see why you're a writer, by the way. You write fiction and you act, and that brings us to my big picture question for you. Has acting and fiction writing contributed to your happiness? If so, how? And if not, why the heck do you do it?
Well, again, as you guys know, happiness is sort of a vague term in many ways, and that's why it's happier, like as you mentioned. So if we're looking at happiness from the sort of Greek version of eudaimonia, of a sense of fulfillment, I would say that yes, absolutely, acting and writing and all the things that don't pay the bills, in fact, cost me money half the time, or appall my life. Like, is it worth it? Yes. Is it net positive for me? Yes. And it's interesting to me that there was a time when I was experiencing more of the Greek word, I'm going to probably pronounce it wrong. It's like acedia, acedia, acedia. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's sort of and I think that was St. Augustine would write about this. That's like the opposite of like this dread, this overwhelming sense of dread, because it's like emptiness. You feel empty. And when I've noticed when I don't allow or don't give myself the time to focus on my more creative pursuits, that acedia kind of,
you're filled with dread.
Creeps back in. A bit. Yeah. I mean, hey, I've worked in like 26 bars and restaurants over my life. I know what that dread feels like, standing there waiting for the clock to strike. So, and I think that's something that a lot of people experience, even if by the outside looking in, it looks like they've got it all together.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that captures a lot of why I feel like I need to create things. Is that if I don't, I have an itch. I guess you could call it dread. You know what I mean? I feel so much better when I get back to being creative about certain things that I like to do. So that's a nice way of capturing, why we do some of these things that don't make us money, that are just,
Yeah. And if we really look at creativity, I don't create. Being creative and being an artist are not the same thing, and anyone can be creative. I mean, creativity is really saying, hey, there's a problem, I want to figure out a way to solve it, and then actually using your will and taking a chance and taking a step towards that. I mean, that's creative. So I also think maybe sometimes people sell themselves short. Well, I don't play an instrument, or I'm not an actor, or whatever it is.
Nice.
That's a great
showing how everybody's creative, really.
Very good.
Everyone's creative. Yeah, absolutely.
Or can be. Hopefully, can find opportunities for creativity in their everyday life. That's good.
Exactly.
Well, one of our final questions comes from the inspiration for our show. Would you, Monica? And I think I kind of already know the answer, but I don't want to hear you extrapolate, be creative about it. Would you say that philosophy bakes no bread, as the famous saying goes, or that it does, and why and how? If it does bake bread, how does it bake bread?
Yeah, I want to know first, who said it doesn't? Who was it that said that?
Well, there's a lot of different versions. Early on, Aristotle is known to have brought up the language people would say to him that beards don't bake bread, because it was the philosophers who had the beards in the agora, and that turned into later philosophy bakes no bread. And then it got put in. There's a lot of different people who sort of brought that up. And then the poet Novalis wrote a defense of philosophy saying philosophy may bake no bread, but it can procure for us God, the soul, and immortality. Which then is more profitable, philosophy or economy? Right. And so, of course, people remember the philosophy doesn't bake bread part, though. And William James brought it up later because he cared about the cash value of philosophy. And he said, well, philosophy may bake no bread, and it does these things. And so most people who invoke it are responding to that, trying to say that it matters. And yet that's the saying, that's the assumption that people have to fight, is that, philosophy is just this useless pursuit. Right.
Right. And of course, look, obviously, I think that philosophy is very useful, but I think, to be a little out of the box, it's kind of a lame expression, actually. But I would say, who cares? Philosophy's job is not to bake bread. And that might be a dangerous comparison to make sometimes, because again, if I were to substitute art bakes no bread,
right.
But art is still important whether it bakes bread or not, and philosophy is still important whether it bakes bread or not. And I would argue, yes, that philosophy can and does bake bread, but it's almost above that. And I don't mean above it in the sense of people who are philosophers, that's more important than people who, do work in a factory or something like that. It's that we have to aim at least to try to be courageous enough to challenge the way that we think and to ask questions of ourselves and each other and the universe. And while we can live about our normal daily lives without that, if we choose, why would we choose that? It's so much better if we do. And better, it might also be really hard and really annoying at times, but more meaningful.
That kind of reminds me of the pastry defense. You remember that one, Anthony? The language of nobody defends the creation of pastries. You know what I mean? They're fantastic. They're above need for argument and definite.
Yeah, I really like this answer. I think it's one of my favorite ones I've heard to the question. I think it's nice.
Oh, that means a lot. I was actually sitting there thinking, wait, I should have had an answer for this. But improv. That's
there you go.
Another little acting.
It can bake bread, but it doesn't need to.
And need. Ooh, now you got a pun. I love a pun.
Needing.
Doesn't need to. Oh, that makes me want to tell jokes, Eric.
Well, as you know, Monica, we want people both to see the serious side of philosophy as well as the lighter side. So one of our final bits we have in the show is called Philosoph-Funnies. Say, Philosoph-Funnies.
Philosoph-Funnies.
Say, Philosoph-Funnies.
Philosoph-Funnies.
We'd love to hear if you've got a favorite joke or a funniest fact, Monica, either about philosophy or about acting or about what you've been doing in your podcast. Yeah. Have you got a story or a joke for us?
So there's many a funny story or pun, but I was thinking about something that might be helpful for your audience and something that ties into sort of an overall lesson that I've also learned this year is related to my acting days. And that was when I made my Broadway debut, I was an understudy. And I remember very distinctly, so I was understudying the actresses Laura Linney and Alicia Silverstone here in New York. And when it debuted, it was actually in LA, and it was Anna Gunn, who's most people know as the wife on Breaking Bad, and then also Alicia Silverstone there. And I remember going on for Alicia the very first time. And, to give a little backstory, you don't ever rehearse when you're the understudy. I had no rehearsals with the other actors. I never even rehearsed in the costumes or with the real props. And we rehearsed with the stage manager reading some lines and the other understudy reading the other lines. And I remember showing up, it was a Friday, and that was when our understudy rehearsals were. And at 5:00 after we finished for that day, he said, "Okay, so you're going on tonight."
Oh.
And that's how they were testing me to see we don't want to tell her she can do it because this was, not very long into the run. And so sheer terror, obviously hit me. And I remember, oh God, I so vividly remember being backstage and just wanting to just vomit and wanting to run away and think, but I mean, you can, like, you've got you either get on that stage or you walk out that door. And if you walk out that door, like, that's probably going to be it for you. And so I was like, okay, let's do this. And then literally I finally, it's time for my cue for my entrance. And I can hear from like the second row, an elderly woman say very loudly, "That's not Alicia Silverstone." And I'm like, lady, in my mind, I'm just, okay, great. And 2 seconds later, I have to take off my jacket in the scene. Like I said, we hadn't rehearsed with anything. And they gave me a bracelet that at least I didn't normally wear. It was a different one. And it just goes flying across the stage. And, I've got like I've got props galore, that I'm dealing with. And I remember this moment where all the actors, we just kind of all looked at each other. Are we really doing this? And it was from then on, we just, all right, game on. It's happening. And then it was so much fun. And it was actually, to this day, the most thrilling acting experience I've had, because we really did have to listen to each other and we really did have to be very, very present. And yeah, but I also just think, if you're in the audience, don't think people on stage can't hear you. That's for dang sure.
That's not Alicia Silverstone. That is a great story.
Yeah, they just told you, so you had to go on that night right after you just rehearsed. It
was literally 2 hours later, I think, was curtain.
Man.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's funny. Well,
don't even have time to panic and think and say no. Just, I guess so. Oh, boy.
Anthony and I usually also gather a joke or two, maybe 2 or 4 or whatever. But when we were getting ready, looking for jokes relating to the happier hour, there were so many people walking into a bar jokes that were actually really worth telling. I think that we have more than usual.
All right. The past, present, and future walk into a bar. It was tense.
I've even heard that one. And it's
Times New Roman, Ariel, and Helvetica walk into a bar. The barman shouts, "Get out! We don't serve your type here."
Oh, Lord.
Oh, groan.
An amnesiac walks into a bar, chats up a beautiful lady, leans in, says, "So, do I come here often?"
Oh, man. Wait, crickets again.
That's a bad one.
2 dragons walk into a bar. The first one says, "It sure is hot in here." The second one snaps, "Shut your mouth."
That's a good one because you got a visual.
Got a little visual.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. So a $5 bill walks into a bar, and the bartender says, "Hey, this is a singles bar."
Oh, man. Not bad.
Oh, you guys.
Okay, we got a couple more. Almost
all
there.
Laughing. Oh, we're still all right. Let's go.
A set of jumper cables walks into a bar and orders a drink. The bartender says, "Okay, I'll serve you, but don't start anything." Oh, man.
A snake
crickets.
Oh. A snake slithers into a bar, asks for a beer. The bartender replies, "Sorry, we don't serve your kind here." "Why not?" asks the snake. "Well, you can't hold your liquor." Nope.
Okay, last but not least, a Roman walks into a bar, holds up 2 fingers and says, "5 beers, please." Oh, man.
No.
Oh, man, do we deserve a rim shot?
Too many jokes. All right.
I had fun anyway.
Good. All right.
All I know is if you guys get the book deal with those and we didn't get with the ones with our brilliant philosophy pun jokes, I'm going to be real pissed.
Ours are not good at all. So we do like to end the show by taking advantage of the fact that today we have some, powerful social media allows for two-way communications, even for programs like radio shows. So we want to invite our listeners to send us their thoughts about any big questions that we've raised on the show. And I think we've raised some really wonderfully big ones today.
That's right. Given that, Monica, we'd love to hear your thoughts about what question you propose we ask our listeners for future segments that we call You Tell Me. Have you got a question to pose for our listeners?
Sure. And by the way, I love that you do this because at the end of all of my podcast episodes, I ask you a question. It's very important. Yeah. Awesome. I'll tie mine into my funniest story, with the understudy thing. And this has been brought up to me before. Even people that didn't know I was a therapist, or without a therapist, Freudian slip. Even my therapist even asked me this, not knowing the understudy story, saying, stop being the understudy to your own life. And so I guess my question for the listeners is, in what ways are you being the understudy to your own life, and what can you do to change that today?
Ooh.
Jeez, that's a good question.
Ooh.
Stop being the understudy to your own life, and how would you change it?
Yeah, there's some things I've been meaning to do. I've been dragging my feet on, and that makes me think of things I need to get done. I like it a lot.
Yeah, like somebody is like, hey, curtains up in 2 hours, which or that could be metaphor, for the Grim Reaper. The Grim Reaper is going to come. Your time on stage is done. What do you want to have, what are you going to do with it?
Whoa.
All right. Well, I got to get out of this office. I know that. All right. When you put it that way. All right. Well, Monica, before we wrap up, is there anything besides the Happy Hour podcast you want to plug? Can you give us maybe a sneak peek about what you're going to be doing in season 2?
Sure. So if this is airing soon, the season 2, the next live show is going to be September 29th. It's a Saturday, and you're hearing it here first, I think, actually. And we're going to do an interesting time. We're going to do an actual happy hour time at 4 p.m. and the guests will be announced soon, as well as the topic. So I'm excited to have the live event starting up again. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. The rest I'll keep up my sleeve for the moment.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Philosophy Bakes Bread. Your host, Anthony Cashio, and Eric Weber are really grateful to be joined today by Monica McCarthy. Thank you, Monica.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
It really was. It was a wonderful conversation. We would love to hear from everyone listening. Send us your thoughts about anything you've heard today that you'd like to hear about in the future, or about this specific question or questions we've raised for you. Monica's raised a doozy of a question, right? What would you do to stop being the understudy of your own life right now? How would you change?
Right.
Because you're going to have to do it before you're comfortable. Just like the understudy is going to have to go on before she feels ready.
Remember, everyone, you can catch us on Twitter, Facebook, and on our website at philosophybakesbread.com. And there you'll find transcripts for many of our episodes. Thanks to Drake Bowling, an undergraduate philosophy student at the University of Kentucky. Thank you, Drake.
Thanks, Drake.
And thanks also to Stephen Barrera for help with this production. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
And one more thing, folks, if you want to support the show and to be more involved in the work of the Society of Philosophers in America, Sophia, the easiest thing to do is to consider joining as a member, heading over to philosophersinamerica.com.
And if you're enjoying this show, we hope you will take a quick second to rate and review us wherever you're finding us today, whatever podcast app or website you're finding us on. I think we're on Spotify now, aren't we, Eric? Moving up in the world, and YouTube. So a nice review kind of helps us reach more people, and that's sort of how the algorithms work. And of course, you can always email us at philosophybakesbread@gmail.com. That's all one word, philosophybakesbread@gmail.com. And you can also call us and leave us a short recorded message with a question or a comment that we may be able to play on the show at 859-257-1849. That's 859-257-1849. Join us again next time on Philosophy Bakes Bread, food for thought about life and leadership.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.